When I first bought my house in this suburban neighborhood, I thought I was stepping into the kind of life you see in those glossy real estate magazines. Quiet streets, trimmed lawns, and a friendly wave from neighbors as you walked your dog in the evening. The house itself wasn't a mansion, but it was perfect for me. 3 bedrooms, a big backyard, and a garage I could finally turn into my workshop. After years of renting cramped apartments, it felt like I was finally putting down roots. I told myself, this is it. This is where I'll spend the next chapter of my life in peace. What I didn't know then was that peace would become a rare commodity, thanks to 3 little letters that still make me roll my eyes. HOA. At first, I didn't even think much about it. Homeowners Association. I'd heard about them, sure, mostly in jokes and horror stories online, but I figured it couldn't be that bad. They took care of the landscaping in the common areas, put up Christmas lights at the subdivision entrance, and sent out newsletters about block parties. Sounded harmless enough. But like a lot of things in life, what looks harmless from a distance turns out to be a nightmare up close. The first few weeks were fine. I mowed my lawn, waved to the neighbors, and kept to myself. Then one day I decided to repaint my front door. Nothing flashy, just a nice deep navy blue that gave the house a little personality. The paint had barely dried before I found a note taped to my door from the HOA. It said, "Your front door color does not comply with community standards. Please submit a request for approval before making alterations to your property." I stared at the paper, thinking it had to be a mistake. Who in the world cared what color my front door was? I called the number at the bottom of the letter, and that's when I had my first conversation with Marlene, the HOA president. If you've ever met someone who talks like they're auditioning for a villain role in a soap opera, you know what I mean. Her voice was syrupy sweet, but sharp at the edges, like she was smiling while sharpening a knife. She told me my door clashed with the overall neighborhood aesthetic, and I'd have to repaint it a more neutral color. I actually laughed out loud on the phone, but she wasn't joking. She even emailed me a PDF of approved door colors, which all looked like different shades of beige, gray or brown. I thought about fighting it, but in the end, I didn't want to start off on the wrong foot. I sighed, bought another bucket of paint, and went back to boring beige. I told myself, fine, one little compromise. Let's keep the peace. But that's the thing with people like Marlene. Give them an inch, and they'll take a mile. Not long after that, I got another letter. This time it was about my mailbox. Your mailbox does not meet community standards. Please replace it with one of the approved designs. Approved designs. I kid you not, they had an actual catalog of mailboxes, all of which looked identical, and of course, they were twice the price of a regular one. I gritted my teeth, but I went along with it again. I swapped out my perfectly fine mailbox for one that looked like everyone else's. Then came a warning about the height of my grass, even though I mowed every weekend. Then a complaint about the small shed I was building in my backyard, which, according to them, needed to be reviewed by the architectural committee. It felt like every move I made, someone from the HOA was standing there with a magnifying glass, ready to pounce. The last straw was the packet. One day I came home from work and found a thick envelope in my mailbox. Inside were printed design plans for my house. I'm talking about color renderings, lists of required changes, even landscaping suggestions. They wanted me to repaint my entire house a lighter color, replace my dark shingles with a community standard gray, add shutters to the windows, and plant specific shrubs along the walkway. At the bottom of the letter, it said failure to comply would result in weekly fines added to my account. I sat at my kitchen table, flipping through the pages in disbelief. It wasn't just nitpicking anymore. They were trying to redesign my home as if they owned it. I called Marlene again, and this time I didn't bother being polite. I told her straight up that they were out of line. She, in turn, told me that when I bought a house in this neighborhood, I agreed to uphold the values of the community. I reminded her that I owned my property, not her little committee. She said, "You agreed to the rules, and if you don't like them, maybe you should consider moving." That did it. Something in me snapped. I wasn't going to be bullied out of my own home. If they wanted a war, I was going to give them one. But I wasn't going to do it by yelling or breaking rules. I was going to beat them at their own game. I started paying closer attention to the HOA office. It was a small brick building near the entrance of the neighborhood, with a polished sign out front that said, Community Association Headquarters. Every time I drove past it, I saw Marlene's car parked out front. They held their board meetings there, printed their newsletters, and basically used it as their little kingdom. I got curious about who owned it. A few calls to the county clerk's office later, I discovered something interesting. The HOA didn't own the property. They leased it. And even better, the land it sat on was up for sale. You can probably imagine the grin on my face when I heard that. I contacted the realtor, went through the paperwork, and in a matter of weeks, I signed the deed. The property and the building the HOA used as its office was mine. They had no idea. The next HOA meeting rolled around, and I walked into that little brick building with the deed in my hand. Marlene and the rest of the board were sitting around their conference table, sipping coffee and shuffling papers. I dropped the deed on the table and said, "I'm your new landlord." The room went dead silent. Marlene blinked at me like I'd just spoken another language. I explained calmly that I now owned the building, their lease was terminated, and they had 30 days to vacate. The eruption that followed was glorious. They sputtered, they argued, they threatened legal action, but the paperwork didn't lie. I owned the place, and they had no rights to it anymore. By the end of the month, they were hauling their filing cabinets and folding chairs out of the building and into Marlene's garage. It was the sweetest victory I'd ever tasted. But I wasn't done yet. See, they had tried to redesign my house, so I decided to redesign their office. Except instead of making it prettier, I went the other way. I hauled in scrap metal, old appliances, rusted car parts, and broken furniture. I parked a dented old pickup truck right out front and let the weeds grow tall around the building. I hung a big wooden sign that read, Junkyard. Every time the board members drove past their former headquarters, they had to look at the mess and know exactly who put it there. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Some people hated it, but plenty of others loved it. Turns out I wasn't the only one sick of the HOA's nonsense. Neighbors stopped me on walks just to say, "Man, you gave them what they deserved." The junkyard became a kind of monument to rebellion, a middle finger to the people who thought they could control everyone else. And the best part? There was nothing they could do. It was my property, and as long as it was safe and legal, they had no authority over it. They tried complaining to the city, but the city told them the same thing. It's his land. The HOA was toothless, humiliated, and suddenly very quiet. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, I finally had peace. After I officially turned their old office into a junkyard, I thought that would be the end of it. A clean blow, a symbolic gesture, and a way to let them know I wasn't going to be pushed around anymore. But if you've ever dealt with people like Marlene, you know they don't just go quietly into the night. They stew, they plot, and they look for ways to claw back control. A week after the sign went up, I got a knock on my door. It was one of my neighbors, a guy named Phil who lived a few houses down. He looked nervous, shifting from one foot to the other. "Hey, just wanted to give you a heads up," he said. "Marlene's been talking. She's telling people your junkyard is bringing down property values. Says she's going to the city council about it." I laughed and invited him in. Over a couple of beers, Phil admitted that half the neighborhood hated the HOA but had been too scared to say anything. "They fine us for stupid stuff," he said. "Last year, my wife got a letter because our Halloween decorations stayed up one day past the deadline. I had to pay $50 for that." He shook his head. "Honestly, what you did? You're kind of a hero." That gave me an idea. If people secretly hated the HOA, maybe I wasn't alone in this fight. Maybe the junkyard wasn't just about me sticking it to Marlene. It could be about giving everyone else a voice. Sure enough, the next HOA meeting, now held in Marlene's cramped living room, was packed. Word had spread that the board was going to discuss community concerns about the junkyard. I showed up, of course, because why wouldn't I? Marlene glared at me from across the room as I settled onto her couch. She started the meeting with her usual pompous tone, thanking everyone for coming and then immediately launching into a rant about the unsightly mess near the neighborhood entrance. She pointed out how potential buyers might be turned off, how property values could drop, and how the integrity of the community was at stake. I let her talk for a good 10 minutes before I raised my hand. "Quick question," I said. "Didn't you all try to redesign my house without my permission?" A few people chuckled. Marlene's face turned red. "That's not the point," she snapped. "Oh, I think it is," I said. "You want to control how everyone else lives, but the second you lose your shiny little office, suddenly you're the victims. The truth is, this neighborhood doesn't need an HOA. What we need is some freedom to live in our own homes without being micromanaged." To my surprise, several neighbors nodded. One older gentleman, Mr. Jenkins, spoke up. "I've lived here 20 years, and the HOA used to be about keeping the pool clean and making sure the streetlights worked. Somewhere along the way, it turned into a dictatorship." The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement. Marlene banged her gavel. Yes, she actually had a little wooden gavel she loved to use, and tried to regain control. "This meeting is not about debating the HOA's existence," she barked. "It's about dealing with the eyesore that Mr. Thompson has created." I leaned back, smiling. "That eyesore is on my property, paid for with my money. And as far as the law is concerned, there's nothing you can do about it." The meeting dissolved into chaos after that. Some people shouted at Marlene, others defended me, and a few just sat quietly, clearly fed up with the whole circus. By the end, nothing had been resolved except one thing was clear. The HOA's iron grip on the neighborhood was slipping. Over the next few weeks, the junkyard became a strange sort of landmark. Kids rode their bikes past it like it was a haunted house. Teens took selfies in front of the junkyard sign and posted them online. A few neighbors even asked if they could drop off their old junk to add to the pile. I said, sure, why not? Before long, the place had refrigerators, lawnmowers, and rusted bicycles stacked like some kind of rebellious art installation. Of course, Marlene hated it. She filed complaints with the city, called code enforcement, even tried to get the county health department involved. Every time, the answer came back the same. As long as it wasn't hazardous or blocking traffic, I was within my rights. I kept everything contained, fenced off, and relatively safe. Ugly? Absolutely. Illegal? Not a chance. One afternoon, I was out front raking leaves when Marlene marched up my driveway, her heels clicking like gunshots. She didn't even say hello. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she hissed. I set down the rake and looked her dead in the eye. "I don't think I'm clever. I think I'm free." "There's a difference." She pointed a finger at me. "You're destroying this neighborhood." "No," I said calmly. "I'm reminding this neighborhood that we're homeowners, not tenants in your kingdom. You don't get to tell me what color my door is, what plants I grow, or how I decorate my house. You lost that privilege when you tried to redesign my life." Her face twisted like she'd bitten into a lemon. Without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed off. I watched her march down the street, and I swear I felt lighter than I had in months. But the story didn't end there. The junkyard sparked something bigger. Neighbors started talking, really talking, for the first time in years. Without the fear of HOA fines hanging over them, people admitted they'd felt suffocated. One guy had wanted to build a treehouse for his kids but had been denied. A woman down the street had been fined for hanging laundry outside. Another family had been warned about their Christmas lights being too bright. Little by little, the neighborhood realized the HOA wasn't protecting them. It was controlling them. And now that the office was gone, its power was crumbling. A petition started circulating to dissolve the HOA altogether. I didn't start it, but I sure signed it. Within a few months, the required percentage of homeowners had voted, and the HOA was officially dissolved. The day the announcement went out, I stood in front of the junkyard with Phil and Mr. Jenkins, sipping cold beers while the sun set. "Can't believe it's finally over," Phil said, shaking his head. "No more fines, no more letters, just freedom." Mr. Jenkins chuckled. "Funny thing is, all it took was one man with a junkyard." We clinked bottles. And for the first time, the neighborhood actually felt like a community. Not because we all looked the same, but because we'd stood together against something that was wrong. Over time, I cleaned up the junkyard. I hauled away the broken appliances and rusted metal, leaving just the building itself. I turned it into a workshop, a place where I could tinker on projects without bothering anyone. But I left the big wooden junkyard sign out front, a permanent reminder of what had happened. Every time Marlene drove past, and yes, she still lived in the neighborhood, she had to see it and remember the day her little empire fell. And me? I got my peace back, the freedom to paint my door navy blue if I wanted, to build a shed without begging for permission, to live in my own home without someone breathing down my neck. Sometimes people ask if I regret making such a scene, if maybe it was too much. I always smile and say the same thing. Nope. They tried to redesign my house. I redesigned their world. In the months after the HOA officially dissolved, the neighborhood felt different. Not just in the little ways, like seeing Christmas lights stay up until February or a couple of kids painting their fence posts bright colors, but in the big ways, too. People walked slower when they strolled down the street. Neighbors actually waved and stopped to chat. There was a sense of relief in the air, like everyone had been holding their breath for years and finally exhaled at the same time. But to really appreciate how far we'd come, I need to back up a bit. Before the junkyard, before the showdown with Marlene, there had been smaller battles that wore me down one by one. Things that seemed trivial on the surface but added up to a pattern of control. Take my backyard shed, for example. It wasn't even visible from the street, but the minute I started framing it out, I got a letter saying I hadn't submitted the proper request for architectural review. I filled out the paperwork just to play along, thinking they'd rubber stamp it. Instead, they sent back a list of suggested modifications. They wanted it painted to match the house, with decorative trim and a sloped roof facing a certain direction. It was a shed, not a guest house. I remember standing in my backyard with a hammer in my hand, staring at their letter and thinking, these people have lost their minds. Or the time they fined me because my trash cans were visible from the street for an extra day after pickup. That one cost me $75. I'd been out of town visiting family, and when I came back, there was a bright orange violation notice taped to my garage door like some kind of scarlet letter. I tried explaining, but they didn't care. Rules were rules, they said. Pay up or face further penalties. And who could forget the time I strung up Christmas lights that blinked in different patterns? Within 48 hours, Marlene called me personally to say they were distracting drivers and had to come down. I asked her if there had been any accidents on our quiet little cul-de-sac. She didn't answer. Instead, she threatened another fine. It was death by 1,000 cuts, and I wasn't the only one bleeding. Phil, my beer-drinking neighbor, once got fined because his teenage son parked his car on the street overnight. Another family had a blow-up Santa Claus in their yard during December, and the HOA told them it was inconsistent with holiday decor standards. Imagine telling a kid their Santa isn't allowed. That's the level of nonsense we were living with. So when I bought their office and turned it into a junkyard, it wasn't just about me. It was about every single person who'd ever been humiliated, fined, or scolded over something that didn't matter. And the more people saw the junkyard, the more they remembered their own run-ins. That's why the rebellion caught fire. It wasn't one man against the HOA. It was an entire neighborhood that had finally had enough. Now, don't get me wrong. Not everyone was thrilled. There were a handful of neighbors who loved the HOA because it gave them a sense of order. You know the type. The ones who measure their grass with a ruler and call the cops if your car radio is too loud. A woman named Karen, yes. Her real name, marched right up to me one day while I was unloading scrap metal and demanded I restore the dignity of the community. I told her politely that dignity had left the building a long time ago, and if she wanted it back, maybe she should start by asking why Marlene thought she had the right to redesign other people's homes. She stormed off in a huff, muttering about standards and respect. But here's the thing. People like Karen were suddenly outnumbered. And they knew it. The real turning point came at a neighborhood barbecue. It wasn't official, just a gathering some folks put together in the cul-de-sac. Before the HOA dissolved, events like that were rare because everything had to be approved and scheduled, complete with permits and guest lists. This one, totally spontaneous. People brought folding chairs, kids rode their bikes, and someone dragged out a big speaker for music. I showed up with a cooler of beer, and before long, I was surrounded by neighbors slapping me on the back and saying things like, "You're the guy who finally took Marlene down." I didn't feel like a hero, but in that moment, I realized the junkyard had done more than stick it to the HOA. It had given people their neighborhood back. Of course, Marlene didn't just vanish. She still lived there, still drove past the old office building every day. I'd catch her glaring at the junkyard sign like it was a personal insult carved in stone. Sometimes she'd slow her car, roll down the window, and shake her head dramatically before speeding off. Other times, she'd whisper with Karen at the mailbox like they were plotting a coup. But no matter how much she fumed, there was nothing she could do. The power she once wielded was gone, and all she had left was bitterness. A few months later, she actually put her house up for sale. Word around the block was she couldn't stand living in a community where nobody listened to her anymore. When the for sale sign went up, Phil cracked open a bottle of champagne and we toasted right there in my driveway. "To Marlene," he said, raising his glass. "May she find another neighborhood to terrorize." After she moved out, things really settled down. Without the HOA breathing down our necks, people started personalizing their homes again. One guy painted his shutters bright red. A family down the street planted sunflowers that grew taller than their fence. I repainted my front door navy blue, the way I'd wanted all along. Funny thing is, the neighborhood didn't fall apart like Marlene predicted. Property values didn't tank, lawns didn't turn into jungles, and nobody built a neon pink castle on their lot. If anything, the place felt more alive than ever. As for the junkyard, it became a kind of local legend. Teenagers would bring their friends from other neighborhoods just to see it. I even caught a couple of folks using it as a backdrop for graduation photos, which cracked me up. Eventually, I started cleaning it up, hauling away the bigger pieces of scrap and organizing what was left. But I never took down the big wooden sign. That stayed right where it was, bold letters spelling out Junkyard like a badge of honor. Sometimes I'd sit in front of that sign with a cold drink and just watch the cars drive by. Every once in a while, someone would honk and give me a thumbs up. Other times, a stranger would stop and ask about the story. I'd tell them the short version. HOA tried to redesign my house, so I bought their office and turned it into this. Their eyes would go wide, and then they'd laugh, shaking their heads in disbelief. "Man, I wish I could have done that to my HOA," more than one person said. And maybe that's the real legacy of the junkyard. It wasn't just about beating Marlene at her own game. It was about showing people they didn't have to roll over when someone tried to push them around. It was about reminding homeowners everywhere that they actually own their homes, no matter what some committee of busybodies says. To this day, I still live in that house. The navy blue door is there. The shed stands solid in the backyard, and the workshop hums with whatever project I'm tinkering on. Every time I pull into my driveway, I feel a little surge of pride. Not because I won against the HOA, but because I stood up for myself and, in the process, gave my neighbors the courage to stand up too. So when people ask if I regret it, if I regret buying that office, turning it into a junkyard and making such a scene, I tell them absolutely not. If anything, I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Because sometimes the only way to deal with bullies is to outsmart them, flip the script, and show them their power isn't as absolute as they think. The HOA tried to redesign my house. Instead, I redesigned the neighborhood, and that's a blueprint I'll never apologize for.